Welcome to the podcast on North American literature hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. I'm your host, Mia, and today we're discovering how two books, separated by over 200 years, use satire to critique American politics. These two books are A History of New York by Washington Irving and The Captain and the Glory by Dave Eggers. Joining us is Brian, the researcher who explores in its latest work the topic we are dealing with today. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Mia. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. It's always a pleasure for me to share my research. I hope your listeners find it interesting how these two texts, 200 years apart, still use similar features to criticize American politics.
I'm dying to know more about it, but before we start comparing techniques, let's make an introduction for each book for those who haven't read them. Brian, could you walk us through each of them?
Absolutely. Let's begin with Washington Irving's A History of New York. It was first published in 1809, and it's one of the earliest and most inventive works of American satire. You see, it pretends to be a historical account of New York, from its Dutch beginnings to the English takeover, but in reality, it's much more than that. It's a blend of mock-serious narration, absurd characters, and sharp political wit. Another fun fact is that Irving published it under the playful pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker, a fictional Dutch historian whose voice is intentionally pompous, slightly biased, and full of exaggerations. So Irving, through this narrator, parodies both colonial figures and the overly solemn tone of Enlightenment-style history writing, as we will later talk about. Besides, let's not forget that this came out when the U.S. was still young and struggling to define its culture. So the book played a part in forging a distinctly American literary voice different from the European one. You know, actually, Irving was one of the authors who contributed the most to this idea of making literature fully American.
I see. That's so clever. So Irving definitely is one of the most crucial voices of American literature, isn't he? Like, he is blending so many techniques and, as you said, contributed a lot to this Americanness. Such an amazing writer.
Exactly, like I said, he's not just telling a story, he's undermining the authority of history itself, and in addition, mocking the self-importance of the men who write it and the societies that believe it. It surely is a foundational text for American satire.
Totally. And what about The Captain and the Glory?
That one comes much later, in 2019 in fact. Dave Eggers wrote it as a satirical response to the political climate under Donald Trump. But instead of using realism, Eggers creates an absurdist allegory. The story takes place aboard a giant ship called the Glory, which clearly stands in for the United States. When this narcissistic man unexpectedly becomes captain, selected democratically for unreasonable things, like, for example, his patriotic posturing, the ship quickly descends into chaos and authoritarian spectacle. The great thing about this book is that it's short, it's deceptively simple, and it's very sharp. Eggers intentionally uses fable-like language, almost like childish and minimalist prose to mimic how public discourse has become infantilized under populist politics.
So, it's deliberately easy to read, but not light on meaning. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. The simplicity is a stylistic choice. By doing this, Eggers exaggerates even more the absurdity of the events he's describing. The novella becomes both a critique of Trump's era and at the same time, a timeless warning about what happens when charisma replaces real competence. It's deeply satirical, but also deeply unsettling.
That's very interesting. Okay, so Brain, let's start at the beginning. What do we mean when we say political satire? What's the function of it in literature?
Great starting point. Political satire is essentially a literary attack on the perverted use of power, often conveyed through humor, irony, parody, or exaggeration. Its purpose isn't just to entertain, but to also highlight contradictions and undermining corrupted authority. It works by pointing out the ridiculous in what we often accept as normal.
So, satire isn't just about laughing at the powerful, it's about making us ask ourselves, why are we letting this happen? Right? Like you said, to promote critical thinking.
Exactly. And both Irving and Eggers use their narratives to push readers to see beyond the simple entertainment.
It's amazing to see how two different people from two very different eras use the same devices. Okay, so let's talk about tone. Both books are funny, but not in the same way, isn't it?
Right, Irving's humor is kind of baroque and wordy. It is filled with long, complex sentences. For instance, he describes one colonial figure as having a mastiff mouth and a broad copper nose. So he, by doing this, ridicules leadership with humorous touches. Actually, there are symbolic characters in both narratives. In A History of New York, this is the case of Jacobus von Poffenburg, a character who some researchers say resembles the real-life figure of James Wilkinson, a great military figure back then. He's described as a full-bodied man whose face glowed like a fiery furnace. Again, it's cartoonish, but pointed. Pretty similar to these depictions is Egger's description of the captain, who is known to represent Donald Trump. You know, Eggers, in terms of language, goes the opposite direction. Minimalist, direct, childlike. However, like Irving, he ridicules leadership through his appearance. In this case, the captain is described as large and lumpy and becomes leader not for being the most qualified, but because he said things that popped into his head. Hilarious.
Both styles are funny, but if they use language so different then, in what other ways are they similar?
Well, for instance, in both cases, the humor is meant to disturb. But besides, another different example, they both mock that idea of the manly leader. Irving has Hendrik Kipp fire a musket at the sun and fall over. Eggers has the captain hide in his room, imagining battles against ex-girlfriends and teachers. Both authors are saying, this is what passes for leadership? So again, both ridicule them and make us question. These are the ones we are in the hands of.
That totally makes sense. Now I'm starting to see the connections even more clearly. Okay, so Brian, let's move on to the settings now. So the ship and New Amsterdam, they are more than just settings, right?
That's correct. In Irving, New Amsterdam is a representation of American society. The people are described as much given to slumber and vacuity, which is a clear critique to society's passivity and is kind of pointing that maybe those are the leaders these people deserve. On the other hand, Eggers' ship symbolizes America adrift. Its direction depends on the captain and the mysterious voice in the vent, which, by the way, acts as a symbol of disinformation. The voice whispers problems into the captain's ear, like an imaginary spider infestation, and the captain treats them as real crises. That's actually a really current topic, especially with all the fake news going around and how they create distractions so people don't focus on what actually matters, don't you think?
Yeah, you're totally right. Besides, that part hit me hard. It felt like a critique of how easily manipulated leaders, and by extension, citizens, can be.
Absolutely. That's what makes satire such a powerful tool. It reminds us how fragile truth can be in the hands of the wrong narrator. And I'm not only talking about literature.
Yeah, right. I see what you mean. Speaking of narrators, let's talk about reliability.
This is one of the most clever aspects of both books. Irving's Diedrich Knickerbocker is hilariously unreliable. He openly admits when he's guessing. He says things like, "But this I believe to be true," or "For by my faith," which expose how subjective his history is. Therefore, he is actually also exploring the boundaries between fiction and history. How much of it is fact, and how much can be made up? In the case of Eggers, it is trickier. His narrator doesn't present himself as unreliable, however. By aligning so closely with the captain's worldview, he becomes complicit. For example, the narrator calls the captain's cowardice brave, or at one point says that the voice in the vent made a rational case. Some argue that he is just being ironic, but for me it is not only like that. However, it totally makes sense too. It can be a mix of both, actually.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I can see both sides.
Yeah, like I said, they challenge the idea of a neutral narrative. They make us aware of how much we are trapped in a subjective version.
And what about the role of the people in both books?
This is also key. Irving mocks the Dutch settlers for their laziness and gullibility. For example, one allegory compares them to ants, mindlessly swarming from one place to another. In another scene, the defense strategy for the city is to raise windmills and a flag, which, as you probably already guessed, is actually pure spectacle. In that way, Irving is showing how patriotic symbolism replaces action. And the worst thing is that citizens accept it. Eggers does something similar. After the captain is elected, the passengers either justify it by saying all captains are flawed or collapse from despair. There's even a line about citizens being too emotionally wrecked to get out of bed. It's a sharp critique of political apathy and helplessness.
So, it's not just about mocking leaders, it's about questioning why we accept them, right?
Exactly. Both books suggest that bad leadership is not only the own leader's fault, but of society.
Interesting. So, as we wrap things up, why this comparison? Why these two books? Why does it matter? Could you explain it for the audience? Just to get them thinking.
Sure. Well, because history repeats itself, but satire sees it first. Irving shows us that even in 1809, leadership was performative and society was easily manipulated. Eggers reminds us that not much has changed. We're still so vulnerable to manipulation, even 200 years apart. And more importantly, both authors use humor not to dismiss the danger, but to highlight it in an entertaining way. A well-placed joke can expose a lie better than a fact ever could. Don't you believe?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes complacency uncomfortable, and sometimes that's the first step toward change. Well, we've come to an end, sadly, but before closing this chapter, let's make a recap, should we? So, to quickly sum up, today we saw how A History of New York by Irving and The Captain and the Glory by Eggers both use satire to criticize American politics, even though they were written 200 years apart. It's crazy to see how not so much has changed.
Exactly. I also mentioned how Irving mocks historical authority and early leadership with elaborate, exaggerated narration, while Eggers uses a simple, absurd allegory to critique modern populism. Different styles, but the same goal: exposing the dangers of incompetent leadership. It's up to the reader to choose which style suits them best. As for me, I would recommend to read both. By the way, what's your favorite part of what we've talked about?
Good question. Personally, I love how both remind us that bad leadership isn't just about the leaders, it's about the society that enables them. It definitely makes us question our present. It's a wake-up call, actually, but disguised in humor.
Right. Satire makes us laugh, but it also makes us think. And that's what makes these books so powerful.
Totally. Well, Brian, this has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your research with us.
Thank you, Mia. It's been a pleasure. If my research sparked any reflection to any of the listeners, or just gave you a new way to think about politics and literature, it's been totally worthy.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us in the podcast on North American literature, hosted by the research group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. See you next time.